Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. During the days of the Soviet Union, there was a massive resource for feeding people. The Aral Sea was a huge lake covering more than 26,000 square miles, and it was full of fish. And it actually produced 1/6 of all the fish consumed in the entire Soviet Union came from this one large lake, this inland sea. And Moynok in Uzbekistan boasted the finest fishing fleet in the Soviet Union. Its fishing fleet was the pride of Uzbekistan. Today, people visit Moynok for disaster tourism. Why? Because if you go there today, you can see line after line after line of rusting ships lying on top of dry sand dunes in the middle of a desert. And the Aral Sea is now 80 miles away. Just think about that. This was a fishing port. This was on the shore of the Aral Sea, and now the sea is 80 miles away, and you have all these rusting fishing boats, just row upon row upon row of them, as a testimony to an industry that was destroyed. Why? Because after World War II, Joseph Stalin announced the great plan for the transformation of nature. He announced that 2 rivers were going to be diverted, and that when these rivers were diverted, they would irrigate fields and they would grow cotton, and that would bring great wealth to Uzbekistan. And because the rivers were diverted, it destroyed the ecology of the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea has now reduced to 2 much smaller lakes. And Moynok, the great fishing port, it's now a disaster zone. It's just empty. There's rusting ships 80 miles away from the sea. Nature was fine the way that God had made it. But Stalin wanted to do the great plan for the transformation of nature. But the transformation brought devastation. Yes, it's all very good to be able to grow cotton, but it's not so good if you can't feed yourself. And this great source of food was destroyed through Stalin's meddling with nature. In the book of Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 12, it says, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death." And that was certainly true for the fishing industry in Moynok because of Stalin's great plan for the transformation of nature. Now, you might be saying, well, Nick, that's very interesting. That's a great historical fact. I never knew that. But what's that got to do with how we live our lives today? Well, quite simply, it comes down to thinking that we know better than God. When God says something, we need to do it. When God says to live a certain way, we should live that way, not to earn brownie points, but because God's way is best. Somebody once said this: if we knew everything that God knew, if we could see in the future the way that God can, we would always want to do the will of God because his way is always best. Even when it looks more difficult in the short term, God's way is always best. Stalin tried to improve on God's way of creating the world, and the result was a disaster for the fishing industry. Sometimes we want to try to improve on what God has said. We want to soft pedal parts of the gospel. We want to deny the bits of the Bible that maybe we find difficult or maybe that we find embarrassing. But there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. We need to recognize God's sovereignty, that we don't know better than God. We need to submit to his ways and live by his purposes and plans. And that way is going to be best for us. May God help us to do that today. In Jesus' name, join us again next time for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.